Good afternoon. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. I am Jenna Robinson, president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. Thank you again for attending our education book discussion with Stanley Ridgley. For those of you who don't know about the Martin Center is a nonprofit organization dedicated to higher education reform. We advocate responsible governance, viewpoint diversity, academic quality, cost-effective education solutions, and innovative market-based reform. You can find out more at jamesgmartin.center. The Martin Center's education book discussions are quarterly online events with authors of recent or sort of recent books about higher education or related topics. Thank you to all of our viewers today and to our donors for making events like this possible. Although this event is free, we appreciate those of you who made voluntary contributions. Your support fuels everything we do. I'll hand the floor over to Stanley shortly, but I want to take 1 minute to tell you all how this event will run. First, Stanley will talk for about 20 minutes about his book. Then Stanley and my colleague George Leaf will have a short discussion. And at around 3:10 or 3:15, George will start posing questions from the audience. Viewers, you can post a question by using the Q&A icon at any time. And George will pose those questions to Stanley at the end of the discussion. Viewers on Facebook, simply post your questions in the comment section and we'll be sure to monitor those as well. Also, we are recording this event so you can watch it later or share it online. With that, I will introduce today's speaker. Stanley K. Ridgley is a clinical full professor of management at Drexel University's LeBeau College of Business. He holds a PhD from Duke University and an international MBA from Temple University and has studied at Moscow State University and the Institut de Gestion Sociale in Paris. He is a former military intelligence officer who served in West Berlin and near the Czech-German border, where he received the George S. Patton Award for Leadership from the 7th Army NCO Academy. In addition to his teaching, Dr. Ridgley lectures widely in the United States and internationally. He is Drexel's faculty sponsor for Turning Point USA, serves on Drexel's faculty senate, and is a member of Drexel University's Institutional Review Board. He is a frequent contributor to national media, including the Epoch Times, Academic Questions, and American Greatness, and is the highly praised faculty instructor for the course Strategic Thinking in the DVD series, thegreatcourses.com. And with that, I will turn it over to Stanley.
Well, thank you very much, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here on a very prominent podcast, the education book podcast by the Martin Center. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I've talked today about Brutal Minds, the dark world of left-wing brainwashing in our universities. It's a very controversial title, and I'm going to address three major points before I begin. And they may seem hard to believe. You may raise a skeptical eyebrow when I say some of these things, but I can assure you that it's all documented and it all appears in Brutal Minds. The first major point that I want to make is that thought reform of college students is indeed in operation on almost all university and college campuses under the rubric of social justice education and is sourced out of schools of education. The second major point is that when I say brainwash or thought reform, I refer to the psychological manipulation and behavior modification techniques that are applied to a target audience designed to change their belief system. The target audience in this case, of course, is mainly students, but also some faculty and staff who undergo this type of activity. The third major point is that a bureaucracy exists on every college campus that operates this program, that reproduces itself, that grows in power and influence year by year, which makes it very difficult to reform. It's called student affairs. Sometimes it's called student services. Other places it's called student success. And it is populated in its senior leadership by crypto-Maoist ideologues that are trained primarily in schools of education. Now that's a mouthful. It's those three major points that I wanted to start with because they seem to be the most incredible of the facts that I lay out in Brutal Minds. And so what do I mean by these three major points? First of all, thought reform is in operation on almost all university and college campuses. How is it possible that universities as different as, say, Duke and Penn and Berkeley and Arizona and Chicago all have this same brainwash program? This is because of the nature of the bureaucracy that I will discuss in a few moments. But the point being that this bureaucracy exists and that thought reform is indeed being practiced on these campuses. It is a quasi-legal process. It runs afoul sometimes of human resource protections set up to prohibit precisely this kind of behavior. The doctrine propounded is crypto-Maoist education theory laundered through a Brazilian frontman by the name of Paulo Freire and sourced in college education schools. About that right now. Education schools were taken over a long time ago with regard to its theoretical basis by the critical theorists or critical pedagogists. And the doctrine that informs their major critical pedagogy is Marxist. The major theoreticians in this tradition are Henry Giroux, Ira Shore, Michael Apple, Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, modern day folks such as Ricky Lee Allen and Zeus Leonardo. They're all professed Marxists. Now, regardless of what you think about Marx, okay, let's get that out of the way. These are indeed Marxists, but you can't sell Marxism in an education school. You can't sell it outright in a college or university. So you've got to camouflage it in some way. And the education schools found a way to camouflage this by selecting very much like Al Capone had to run his dirty cash through a frontman to launder that money. The Marxists have to run their theory through a frontman. In this case, the frontman is a Brazilian educationist by the name of Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is a not insignificant figure in education schools. In fact, he is in their pantheon. He is the most revered figure in their pantheon of theorists. His famous book, most famous book, I should say, is Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which came out in 1970. He himself was a Marxist, became a Marxist in the 1960s. He also was a Maoist in the sense that he greatly admired the Cultural Revolution of Mao Zedong. He outright said this in an article about consciência social, or critical consciousness. He said this in 1974. And he said, quote, Mao's Cultural Revolution is the most genial solution of the century with regard to what to do with people who will not come aboard the ideological train. Whereas Lenin shot down the peasants, Stalin shot down the peasants, Fidel never really faced that, never had to do that. Mao has come up with a solution that I consider, I being Paulo Freire, the most genial solution of this century. This is the core of what is being taught in education schools. There's no denying that. And I lay this out, I should say, in Brutal Minds. Now, why is this important? Well, because, aren't education schools somewhat isolated, kind of keeping to themselves? The problems that they cause usually are in K through 12, when the problems we're well aware of. Well, education school folks have never been satisfied with just preaching to the choir there on the education school. They think themselves important and they have important things to say. And they developed a means or a strategy about 20 years ago where they created advanced education degrees, student affairs, educational leadership, higher education management, things of that sort, whereby they would recruit people into these programs, preach their doctrine of critical Maoist, I should say crypto Maoist Freirean ideology, which is basically cribbed from education theory of Mao Zedong. And they would graduate these people into positions created just for them on the college campuses in the bureaucracy called student affairs. Now, why is this important? Well, these folks are not satisfied with simply, making sure that the pizza's hot and the sound system works for karaoke night, that sort of thing. They're not content with making dorm room assignments or showing people where the dining hall is, even though they do that, and that's what they're hired to do. No, they have ambitions. They fancy themselves, according to their literature, as college educators, just like the faculty. They fancy themselves college. They need to teach. They view the student in a holistic fashion. Now, this trope is very important, this idea of being college educators, because it runs up what I call the ladder of abstraction. How can we, these, small-time, small-fry administrators, hope to impact student development if we're over here and the faculty gets all the kudos? Well, what we'll do is we'll call faculty college educators, and we'll call ourselves college educators. So we've built this ladder of abstraction, which is designed to make unlike things seem alike, right? And so now you have college educators over here in academic affairs with the faculty, and you have college educators over there with student affairs. Well, they still don't teach in the curriculum. They say, we'll set up a fake curriculum, and we'll call this the co-curriculum. Now, it's fake classes, fake faculty, fake instructors, and even fake transcripts in some cases. If you look at Rutgers, you look at St. John's, you look at Westchester University issuing fake transcripts for this fake curriculum, again, called the co-curriculum. And you can see this for yourself. If you go to a website of, say, your alma mater or most any major college and type in co-curriculum, and you'll find all kinds of things, wonderful things like difficult dialogues and courageous conversations and privilege walks, perhaps racial caucuses, that sort of thing, which are all vehicles for the brainwash. This is important because these people have students outside the classroom virtually 24/7, especially those students who live on the campus in the residence life, live in dormitories. And the res life instructors, I should say the res life directors, are graduates of education schools, usually in student affairs. Let me interject. If they do not have a degree in some degree in student affairs when they come on board, they are very quickly assimilated and begin working on that de rigueur master's in higher education while they're on site to get those credentials such as they are. So now you have these bureaucrats teaching this crypto-Maoist based doctrine in a paracurriculum or co-curriculum. How are they reinforced? How do they maintain this doctrine's centrality and purity? Well, they are usually members of off-campus nonprofit associations. They're professional associations. We can call them clubs or guilds, and they perform the function that most professional organizations perform, like the NRA or any other kind of club or interest group. But these clubs perform a very special function, and this is to maintain the purity of this ideology. In fact, a lot of what we're seeing on the barricades with regard to the recent terrorist attacks on Israel by Hamas, we see a lot of these protests which are regurgitating the lingo that student affairs has embraced a long time ago, but only now is surfacing into the public discourse and the public consciousness. Things like decolonization, the importance of to decolonize this or that, settler colonialism and indigenous people and indigeneity and transgressing boundaries, all of these kinds of things. There's also the handy standby, no justice, no peace, which you can pull out with a drop of a hat at virtually any protest. And so these organizations maintain the purity of the ideology. They do so through books and journals and conferences and awards for their luminaries and their website. But most important, probably the institutes that they run. These are institutes on how to brainwash students on the campus. Do they call it that? No, of course not. Who's going to call their program brainwashing and say, well, come on in, we're going to No. They call it something else. They call it social justice education. They call it student learning or student development. And in this particular case, they call it the Institute for the Curricular Approach. In other words, they have adapted the lingo and the language of the curriculum. They're going to offer a curricular approach in their co-curriculum. And in this curricular approach, this is how they train folks to propound the social justice message on the campuses, in these institutes, and actually in student orientation, and utilizing games such as the privilege walk and that sort of thing. Again, does this have any real bearing on what happens on the college campuses other than what I've just described? Yes, it does. These off-campus professional clubs, I give you the examples of the ACPA and the NASPA, NASPA. These are the organizations that set the standards for education schools. And so now you see we have the triangle, the three nodes of power. We have education schools that train these student affairs functionaries who teach in a paracurriculum, a co-curriculum, and who are also reinforced by their activities in these two off-campus organizations, which have a combined membership of around 22,000. Okay, and who train these student affairs people in supplementary activities, and who then set the standards for education schools. And you can see this for yourself by going to any educational school on a college campus and typing in or asking, do these graduate programs meet the standards as set by ACPA and NASPA, right? So what is the motto of this one group, ACPA? Well, and here's why it's important. It's boldly transforming higher education. What? Who asked these people to boldly transform anything, let alone higher education writ large? This is their motto. This is their slogan: boldly transforming higher education. And they aim to do this through their brainwashing programs. Now, I do know that word is kind of a lightning rod, and people raise an eyebrow. Brainwashing. Well, it appears in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and the damage that can accrue to people who are subjected to the brainwash. A more formal name for this is thought reform. Of what does it consist? Well, it consists of a psychological manipulation program and behavior modification program designed to change a student's belief system. You're saying, well, when does this take place and where does it take place? Well, it's not exactly like the type of program that's inflicted on the population of communist China, where they can inflict a more rigorous program. We, however, have the protections of those pesky individual rights. And so deception is part of that plan. And I can tell you, the only two places in America where the brainwash is practiced to any great extent is over here with American-style cults, such as the Unification Church or the Moonies or Synagogue or People's Temple, and on American higher education, on America's college campuses. Those are the two places, but they don't call it brainwashing, and they certainly don't advertise it. They call it something else. They call it social justice education, but it uses the very same techniques, literally the same techniques that cults use to recruit folks into the fold. The Unification Church was probably most explicit about this, and much of this appears in Brutal Minds, the techniques that are used by cults and how those techniques are utilized by social justice educators. Brainwashing consists of three parts, three stages, and this is what marks it as a brainwashing program. It was created by Kurt Lewin back in the 1940s. He was a MIT social psychologist, and he called this, if you're ever wondering where the term came from, he coined the term re-education, which has become synonymous with re-education camp. The first stage, when you inflict this on a target, is to unfreeze the target's belief system. Then you change that belief system, and then you refreeze the belief system. He created this program to apply to criminals who he wanted to prevent from sliding back into a life of crime. He also created the idea of T groups, or the encounter group. He's the father of the encounter group. The Communist Chinese followed the same program, and you can look at Edgar Schein's classic work, Coercive Persuasion. Edgar Schein is still alive today. He wrote a book in 1961 called Coercive Persuasion, which he draws the link between Kurt Lewin and the Communist Chinese North Korean form of brainwashing. So, well, you can't say this, and you can't really say this explicitly if you're actually doing this. You can't say, well, hey, come on, and we're going to brainwash you. Today's brainwashing session for young students on the college campus. No. You do something else. You start the brainwash with, you come up with new terminology. The first stage is surrendering. The second stage is the first stage is defending. The second stage is surrendering. And the third stage is transformation. Okay. Now, it starts with deception. It starts with gaining the trust of people whom you do not know, who may be suspicious, but who are open-minded, very much like the recruitment in cults. And it starts with things like an interrogation, a friendly interrogation. But the interrogation is applied in the form of game. I'll give you an example. The fishbowl is one, but the main example is privilege walk. And here students are lined up or put in a line and told they're going to play a game. and they're holding hands, and they're asked a series of leading questions about their privilege. And people who have privilege or say yes to certain questions take a step forward. Those who answer no take a step backwards. And at the end of the series of leading questions, you have a visual image of who has privilege and who does not, who is more privileged and who is less privileged. Well, what the student has just done has just answered questions in a game that is really an interrogation session, answered questions about their personal life, about their parents, about their friends, about their political beliefs, about their social beliefs, all in the form of a game. All the while, the facilitators, the social justice facilitators, are encouraging them, the students, to exhibit trust, to exhibit vulnerability. Make yourself vulnerable. This is part of the lingo. Trust the people to your right and left. Trust me, the facilitator. All of this is designed to break down the healthy skepticism that all of us should maintain at all times. And when you go into a privilege walk, you are walking into a threat situation. That's how it works. That's how the brainwash system works on the campuses. That's the bureaucracy, the three-cornered nodes of power: education, schools, student affairs, and the off-campus groups such as ACPA and NASPA. Utilized to, you see the circle of vice, whereby bureaucrats come into the system, into jobs created just for them. It's a very inbred, incestuous hiring process, hiring friends like themselves, and then encouraging them to get those educational credentials from the education school, and then reinforcing this by membership in these outside organizations. I think it's a brilliant plan if you're on their side and you're trying to transform, if you're trying to boldly transform higher education, as they say they're trying to do. This is the way to go about doing it. And that, in a nutshell, I think, is the basic argument of Brutal Minds. I see that George is here, and if you'd like to, I'll turn it over to George and say thank you so much for the opportunity of sharing these insights that I've gained.
Well, it's a good finally to get to meet you, Stanley.
Likewise.
Even if it's virtually, it's nice to speak. I read your book several months ago, early this year, when it first came out. In fact, I think you sent me a copy before it was actually out. And I read it quickly and wrote about it for the Martin Center. And I think it's a really eye-opening book. I'd like to get into the hands of as many Americans as possible to keep them from making mistakes that would lead to mental damage to their sons and daughters in college.
Yeah.
Now, I have a few questions in mind.
Okay.
And let's kick off with this one. I'm going to start by playing devil's advocate just a little bit. Isn't it overstating matters to say that American college students are really being brainwashed? Sure, some college professors and administrators are trying to convince students to believe that the U.S. needs to make some fundamental changes. But is that really comparable to brainwashing, such as we became familiar with American prisoners of war in the past? What do you say to the people who might roll their eyes and say, "Oh, you're overreacting. This is not really something that we need to be concerned about. It's not so bad." What do you say to them?
Well, I'd be very surprised if they said that after reading what the testimony in Brutal Minds and the self-critique that these people, the self-confession that these brainwashers have provided to us. Now, the fact is that the idea of re-education or brainwashing did not come out of particularly the single source of prisoners of war in the Korean War or today with communist China. It came from Kurt Lewin, who was a big change management guru. His idea of unfreezing, changing, and then refreezing someone's belief system. This is utilized in change management in very mild parts of change management theory. And I should say, he did name it re-education, which was renamed in the 1990s by the educationists to something else, because re-education became unsavory, if you know what I mean. So they renamed it to transformative education. And so when you hear transformative education, which we do hear from the campuses quite often, this is re-education, the renamed re-education. And they're talking about brainwashing, a stage by stage progression of moving a student from one type of belief system to another. And the folks that do this produce manuals and on how to do it. And I've read their manuals. I have some of them with me right now. Let me show you one right now, real quick. This is Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. This is the 1997 edition. It's come out in 3 subsequent editions, the most recent one this year, that actually actually describes how to do a brainwash if you're not, if you're interested in doing that sort of thing. And if you're into social justice, you probably are interested in doing that sort of thing. Now, how does this go about? How would you instruct someone to be a thought reformer? Well, George, here you go. I'm going to teach you how to be a thought reformer here. During this first phase where I have to gain people's trust, here is what the actual manual says from chapter 4. Use low-risk self-disclosure and interaction in the early stages to establish a norm of self-disclosure at the outset if the environment is perceived as supportive, while a person's defenses may be more permeable. Okay, that's the stage of the privilege walk. We're trying to gain your trust. Now, defending or unfreezing the belief system, here's what they say. It's a quote. During this phase, students undergo, quote, challenges to their belief system in an environment that is, quote, supportive and trustworthy. Now, moving into the middle phase where I'm going to change your belief system, this is traumatic. This is where you're trying to impose a feeling of vertigo on a student. Here is the quote. The process is confusing, disorienting, frightening. Students might feel out of control, without known boundaries or familiar ground, and may experience strong emotions such as anger, resentment, a sense of betrayal by those who were supposed to tell them the truth about the social world. Parents, in other words. And when we get to the final stage where we want to cement this new belief system in which they call transforming, here's a quote. A new set of beliefs becomes home base for interpreting experience and creating meaning. The past is reinterpreted and reconstructed into a new frame of reference. That's the brainwash in their own words. And this is why students will come home probably in a couple of weeks from that first Thanksgiving vacation, and they're going to seem so alienated, so angry about something, and you can't fathom what it is. Part of it is the actual brainwash that these students have been subjected to in student orientation and in various seminars and dialogues and conversations that are run on the campus year-round, round the clock. So I think that this procedure is certainly not exaggerated by myself. I'm simply laying out what they say that they're doing. And whether this constitutes a brainwash or not is, well, let's have that discussion. But right now, no one's talking about it except what we see in Brutal Minds.
Well, it seems like they're definitely being indoctrinated into a very alien thought world that adheres to Paulo Freire and Maoism. Let me ask this, Stan. How widespread do you think this is? Do we find this student brainwashing in just a few colleges and universities, or has it really penetrated very widely throughout the American higher education system?
Well, I think it appears on virtually every college campus where there's a significant student affairs presence, and this is the beauty of the bureaucracy. Now, a lot of people tend to blame faculty for this indoctrination, and yes, there are indeed some faculty who do this. Certainly, the faculty in the education schools who train these student affairs people in their lingo and in their doctrine. There are also faculty over in sociology and what is called public sociology. It's not even good enough to be called Marxist sociology. It's just basically poets and journalists and essayists and this I believe folks who are kind of a catch-all. So say, hey, I want to be a sociologist too, and they say, come on, you can be a sociologist. Those people are engaged in the brainwash as well. But the shiny object over here of faculty as being the chief culprits has really served to provide a shield or a mask for the real villains on the college campuses. And I don't use that word villain lightly, because if what I say is true, and it is, then they are villains. If anyone is trying to manipulate our college students psychologically and utilizing behavior modification techniques designed to change a belief system, yes, you are a villain and you need to be called out. I certainly don't do that in my classes, right? That's not the purpose of the college classroom, to inflict a particular type of truth on college students. That's not it. So I would say that the widespread presence of this is to greater or less extent anywhere student affairs has a toehold. And anywhere they do have a toehold, they're growing stronger by virtue of this circle of vice that I described during my initial presentation. About 1,400, 500 campuses. That's what we're talking about here.
So that's a pretty high percentage.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, you were just talking about the personnel who are engaged in this. Talk to our listeners about the background of these people. What do they do? Where do they get their supposed expertise to land these college jobs? What kind of people are we talking about here?
None of these are easily swayed people. These are people who are searching for meaning in their lives, I would say. And this doctrine that I've described, the crypto-Maoist doctrine of Paulo Freire, which is really basically Mao Zedong's education policy, it's intoxicating for these folks. Now, smart people, savvy people, educated people who are exposed to this philosophy, along with a host of other philosophical positions, are not really taken in by this. Okay, this is very interesting philosophy you've got here. You know, it's based in Karl Marx. It's based in the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, and it has a little bit of Maoism in there. It's kind of exotic, but it's just one of many points of view. The problem is this becomes intoxicating for folks because this particular point of view, it offers access to hidden truth. That's the kind of the ticket that for these folks. Wait a minute, you mean if I come in here and I can study with you, I'll have access to what they call critical consciousness? Now, this was a formulation of Paulo Freire. He called it in Portuguese. It was consciência social, which is critical consciousness. What is that? What's a bastardization of Karl Marx's class consciousness? Only now it incorporates race and gender as well as class. And you have consciência social, or critical consciousness, which means that people like myself and you, George, and your audience probably have false consciousness. And it's a tautology in the sense that, well, when you have critical consciousness, that means you don't have false consciousness. And false consciousness means that you haven't evolved to critical consciousness. Your critical consciousness means that you can peer into society and see the contradictions and the relations between power and privilege. And this is just so intoxicating for a young person not exposed to the entire picture. It's a very hermetically sealed view. Okay, so this is why some of them seem so arrogant. So it's amazing that the arrogance of these people who are really dwelling in this philosophical, theoretical ghetto over here, thinking that they have access to truths denied to the rest of us, when the great big world of politics and history and philosophy, the best that has been thought and said, is all out here for the taking. They're isolating themselves over here. And on top of that, they're claiming special knowledge that is not special at all, and it's not new at all. Marx was doing this a long time ago when he developed scientific socialism, which unlocked the secrets of history. Just like Charles Darwin had unlocked evolutionary, he being Marx, had unlocked the secrets of history. And he got this from Hegel, who said that, there's the world spirit. And this all comes from Plato, Plato's cave, where you go back and the idea that I'm going to come out of the cave where we all are blinded by this really cramped existence. And wow, I have discovered the great big world out here. This stuff is old as Plato. And as Alfred North Whitehead said, all the philosophy is just a series of footnotes to Plato. And this, I feel so sorry for the folks who have signed on to this, particularly students, but certainly the faculty as well, that they believe this and that they have been enlightened. And their job is to try to bring us to enlighten. Obviously, we're not going to go quietly. They've got to brainwash us to make this happen.
One of the phrases I remember well from reading your book, Stan, you talk about the supposed research that backs up this approach. You call it cargo cult journals. Talk to us about that.
Well, cargo cults, that's a topic that is so interesting. It's one of the historical oddities in history that deserves a book talk all itself. A cargo cult is a facsimile of reality. It's like a defective model of reality that is designed to achieve the same results of the real thing. And in academia, you know that we have journals that generate legitimate knowledge, and it goes through a rigorous peer-reviewed process. And even after the article is published, there's still a rigorous process of investigation and replication of the experiments, and sometimes articles are withdrawn. Well, there's a whole parallel world of these types of cargo cult or facsimile, simulacra journals that were designed specifically to provide a venue whereby the cargo cultists or these academics or pseudo-academics could exchange articles amongst themselves, peer reviewing their own articles, and to generate a facsimile of the real thing, which is called a cargo cult. If I can diverge this for a second, cargo cults. It was the idea of the cargo cult was created in World War II in the South Pacific, whenever you had the collision of a high technology society with a very primitive native society suddenly thrown together. And the natives had no way of interpreting what was going on with this vast, planes coming from the sky, unimagined wealth, food, clothing, that kind of thing. And so they attributed it to magic. Well, suddenly the cargo folks were gone with the end of World War II. And so they wanted to bring back the cargo. That was the evolution of the progenitor of the cargo cult. They engaged in sympathetic magic, whereby they created a facsimile, runways carved out of the jungle, lit by torches, bamboo airplanes, carved headsets, watchtowers, and guys marching around with wooden rifles, trying to mimic the reality and create a scenario whereby the cargo would return. It's very much like voodoo when you think about it, the idea that you're going to create a facsimile of someone, put some of the DNA, I guess, in there, and then achieve the same, where you can poke the doll and get a reaction out of that person over there. It's magic. You could even call these voodoo journals if you really wanted to get down into it. But if you're interested in the kinds of cargo cult journals we're talking about, I got a couple of them right here. There's no magic associated with them, I should say. The Journal of College Student Development is one of them. I read these things, okay? About Campus, put out by the ACPA. There's a whole list. If you're really interested in this kind of thing, you can go to the National Association of Scholars, NAS, and go to the article by a big book, actually, by David Randall, called Social Justice Education. And in that article, you'll find in chart 20, you'll find over 250 of these cargo cult journals. What we find is kind of an ancestral support of trading back and forth. Okay, I'll cite your article. You saw mine. Here are some of the names here. American Journal of Sexuality Education, the Berkeley Review of Education, Critical Education, Critical Intersections in Education, Critical and Radical Social Work, it goes on and on like this. I could go on close to forever, I guess, as these journals continue to pop up. They're not legitimate journals. They're essays. I've read them. It's basically there's a guy who coined the term way back in the 1960s. I wish I could give him credit for this, but these are essays that are this I believe essay kind of thing. It's this I believe, and they tell what they believe, and they add their mite of lived experience to the great central myth of the critical ideology that they subscribe to. And that's what I mean by cargo cult journals and education. I should say that the co-curriculum is kind of a facsimile or cargo cult version of the curriculum, kind of a rickety structure over here, mimicking the legitimate aspects of the curriculum.
So they attempt to give themselves the veneer of intellectual sophistication by creating journals, and they cite each other. And if anyone doubts them, they say, well, as we showed in this essay in this journal, blah, blah, blah. So they have a veneer of intellectual respectability created by their own efforts. There's no there.
Well, Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winning physicist in 1965, in 1974, he gave a very famous a talk at Caltech where he coined the term cargo cult science, when he says it's very much like the folks, who are carving out runways in the jungle and building bamboo airplanes, trying to generate legitimacy. And what they're generating is pseudoscience. at the look and feel of science. There's a very big difference between non-science, anti-science, and pseudoscience. Pseudoscience, you're trying to jump aboard the science train and be accorded the prestige of science without undergoing the rigorous questioning and procedures it takes to generate legitimate knowledge.
All right, let me ask this. How can students avoid getting trapped? If you sign up for a course and it turns out on day 1 or day 2 that the professor is a raving lunatic, you can just drop the course. Is it harder perhaps for students to avoid these student affairs, student learning types of situations because they aren't really courses you sign up or can drop, but it's more subtle at the student living end of
Right.
things?
Well, I have to congratulate those left-wing radical types who are professors. At least they're honest about what they're doing. And when they're honest about this, they basically, people like George Yancey at Emory and Johnny E. Williams at Trinity, and certainly Darrell Wing Sue at Columbia, Joseph Bassad at Columbia, who was out on the barricade celebrating the attack on Israel just this past week. Those folks are not trying to mask themselves, probably because they have tenure and they can't be fired. Now, student affairs types have to be more subtle. They have to be subtler in what they do. And so, as I told you, they're trying to bring people into this type of situation, and you have to be able to recognize when you're in a brainwash or threat situation or a thought reform situation by virtue of taking a step back and analyze what's going on and understand the lingo that they're going to use. I'll give you an example. I was in one of these sessions where one of the techniques they use is to say, well, we're going to establish guardrails or ground rules for discussion in our group. Euphemistically, the idea is that we're going to guide the discussion so there's no controversy, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what they're doing is they're saying you can't disagree. That's one of the ground rules. You can't disagree with what we're saying. And that's quite a ground rule. I mean, we would love to have that kind of ground rule in a debate, right? But the ground rules is you can't disagree with my point that I'm bringing in, or even if it's factually incorrect. So when students don't give up their rights when they go to college, you don't give up your individual rights, no matter what these people tell you about student judiciary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I have one student who said her dad, who's very cognizant of this stuff, told him, you don't ever go into any type of judiciary inquiry or any type of star chamber proceeding without legal representation. You let me know if they try to do that. That's what this student told to me. And I certainly think it's wise advice. So number one, recognize the tells when you are in a thought reform session. And number two, understand what you can do, because I will tell you, some of these sessions are, quite frankly, close to being illegal because they don't solicit informed consent, written informed consent, and they don't tell you what they're going to do specifically, explicitly, and outlining the dangers, and they don't offer the opportunity to sign that informed consent. If they don't, I would say you need to report those people up the chain within the reporting methods that you have available to you.
Well, one of the startling things about your book, Stan, is that you don't sugarcoat your views at all. And let me read to you a passage. And you write, the university is succumbing to a clearly expressed agenda of an identifiable group of mediocrities who embrace an anti-scientific, anti-enlightenment ideology, and who impose this on undergraduate students with impunity. If folks think of the university as an aristocracy of the learned, of the best, and of the best, and the reality in the bureaucracy is that of a ruling clerisy of the worst and the dullest. Those are strong words, but you think they're utterly justified.
Well, if not, I was understating the problem. The fact I think that if what I say is true, I mean, and it is true, then I think that anyone who is engaging this kind of activity is, number one, accepting as a kind of a universal truth, a crypto-Maoist, kind of a critical theory, neo-Marxist view of the world, and then decides to utilize their position of power and authority to inflict that on students in a clearly identifiable stage-by-stage thought reform process, then they deserve every word. They deserve everything I said there, and they should be investigated. They should be assessed, given the opportunity for retraining in the civic lessons that made this country what it is today. Civic lessons and lessons in what the university is and should be, and the Weberian view of a repository, the best that has been thought and said, passing legitimate, earned, hard-earned knowledge on to subsequent generations, and not a crucible of indoctrination designed to create cadres for the struggles of the future in pursuit of some notional critical consciousness. No, I don't think I was too harsh at all. Some people don't like that sort of talk, I think.
The first time I think I ever heard about this phenomenon, back around 2009, 2010, University of Delaware was called out for an appalling set of student affairs programs that were being run by a bunch of radicals.
Yep.
And the president of the University of Delaware eventually got around saying, oh, well, this is bad. We're going to say no to this. But evidently it's gone underground, and we're still finding the same phenomenon. Maybe they're calling it different names. Evidently, few, if any, college presidents care enough to look and see if this is going on in their campuses and try to root it out. Am I right? They don't care?
No, well, actually, there's no desire to. There's no percentage in it for them. They test the winds to find out what's going on. If it's flying under the radar, very much like this Delaware situation you referred to, which appears in Brutal Minds, I will tell you that kind of victory is very transient. It's not even a victory. All they do is they assess what they did wrong that enabled someone to cancel the program, and then they tighten up the ship and correct the problems so for the next launch. In fact, the people who created that program, one of them, last name is Tweedy, went on to create the Institute for the Curricular Model. And they created, this person and her cohorts or compadres created the whole program that is inflicted on the campuses now called the Curricular Model. So in other words, the Delaware program, which we perceive as perhaps, oh, that was a victory. No, it served as the basis for the Institute for the Curricular Approach that is sponsored by these off-campus programs that tell people, here's how you go about doing it. They publish books. I have their books. I've read their models. This is what they're doing. They don't advertise this on websites. They advertise it certainly amongst themselves. And this is still going on. Now, they mask it in very anodyne, euphemistic language, such as, oh, well, we're interested in student development. We're interested in student learning. We're interested in gains and growth, without being specific about what is actually going on. And this has been their modus operandi from the very beginning. And so but presidents, they're not going to do anything unless they receive some pressure. We're seeing that with respect to these presidential statements with regard to what just transpired in Israel a week ago. And a lot of donors are walking away from the schools saying that you shouldn't have done what you did, or what you did do, you didn't do well enough.
How has your book been received, Stan?
I'll tell you, I am frustrated. I'm not frustrated at critics of the book who there's really no legitimate criticism in the sense that nothing in the book is false. I mean, I'm happy to correct any mistakes, of citation, of quotations, of descriptions, happy to correct that. I am most frustrated by our friends on the right who have think they know what's in there. They're smart people, savvy people, hardworking people working for the integrity in higher education. But whenever they see or hear this book and they go, oh, well, that's nothing new. That's been going on for a long time. Marxists in the academy, that's nothing new. Not understanding that we're not talking about the traditional villains of professors. Let me give you an example. Samuel Abrams, who did a study recently that showed that the disparity between liberals or radical left and conservatives among the faculty is 6-1. We've always had that. We can deal with that, okay? The disparity between the folks I'm talking about, student affairs, bureaucrats, the disparity between left and right is 12-1. And it's getting worse. It's getting worse even as we have this conversation, precisely because of the mechanism that I've described here, of this circle of vice. And so it's not the same old, same old. The enemy is now identified, and it's not who you think it is. We need to take our eyes off that shiny object of the professoriate. Oh, well, you can kind of keep them under watch, okay? But the real enemy, the real worker bees, are the student affairs people and their leadership. So that's the reception that I've had, and I want to hear more people saying, "Wow, I didn't know that. And now I do, and now I know what to do because you in your chapter 9 have made some wonderful recommendations for students, parents, donors, and alumni to take action."
All right, well, let's pursue that theme. Let's agree that college presidents are unlikely to want to fight this scourge. They're pretty much spineless people, and they may even think, well, they're not doing anything so bad. We don't really mind. All right, so who can we look to try to arrest the development and turn it back? What about state legislators, for instance? What could they play a role in this?
Well, number one, I'll answer your question directly, and then I'll answer it in a more broad sense, where state legislatures have a very important role to play, especially with regard to state universities, of course, state-funded universities, because the power of the purse is really the only thing that the bureaucracy types and the senior elites of the president's office will respond to. And the idea that, and of course, they're going to deflect to this challenging academic freedom. No, of course not. There's no right wing on the campuses to speak of. There is no oversight in the universities to speak of. I talk about sleepy boards of trustees. Basically, this is one of the amazing things about it. If you become a college president, you actually are the person who reports on your performance. You have board meetings where you have a staff that's going to collect all the great things that you have done, and you're going to present that to the board of trustees. A nice PowerPoint, you get an attaboy and maybe a salary increase. What we have to do is get energetic, inquisitive boards of trustees, very much like what we're seeing now at the University of Pennsylvania. One has resigned, another has pulled his contributions to Penn because of what they have not been doing. And I think this is a great model for how we can proceed in the future. There's also the possibility for private universities to have federal funding questioned. Think about this now. If you are responsible for a psychological manipulation program that violates federal law in the Office of Human Research Protections, how might that impact your ability to receive federal funding for your projects? Someone might want to tug at that thread and to see how that works out. So I think that this, bad publicity and threats of lowered funding or pulling funding are always powerful incentives for those in the bureaucracy, college presidents, to take a different course. Maybe scratch the chin a little bit, do some Kentucky whinges there and say, maybe we need to change course.
Before I go any further along that line, let me encourage our listeners and viewers to submit their questions using the chat button. We'd like to hear your thoughts. All right, what about alumni? Alumni might be able to play a role in this if they got sufficiently exercised over the degradation of the brand of their degree. Do you foresee that as happening?
Yes, I do. Information flow is great here in the digital age, and the idea that we need to aggregate that type of information. A lot of us tend to think of our alma mater in terms of what it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And universities and colleges have a vested interest in portraying themselves as not having changed. Or if they are changing with the times. At the same time, they're maintaining that nostalgic hook in faculty. I ended my nostalgic hook more than 20 years ago at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I ended my contributions to the Alumni Association because of that university's reaction to 9/11. Okay, hosting sit-ins and having professor-led seminars on why the United States was to blame for the attacks on 9/11. I said, no, thank you. Thank you, but no, thank you. And I've never contributed to the Alumni Association since that point. And I tell them why I don't when they call me. So I think that we need to investigate. We as alumni need to investigate. There's a great organization called I think it's the American Council on Trustees and Alumni, which basically is a coalition of people, of trustees and alumni that investigate and keep tabs on the types of programs that are being run on the college campuses. So information is key, accurate information. And I think one of the big threads that alumni and trustees need to tug on are the student affairs functionaries who are running these types of programs. And I can, I'll tell you the truth, I can look at most any website, I can investigate, which I've done many, many times, the folks who are running the student affairs, and I can tell you exactly what's going on the college campus because it's so formulaic. The articles that they quote, the articles that they cite, the people that they mention as their luminaries, it's all an open book if you know what to look for. So that information is absolutely key.
What about your own school, Drexel?
Well, I'm not going to talk about my own school.
How bad are things on your campus?
Well, I can't talk about because I'm part of the university various channels of reform, I'd like to say. I do what I can on an individual basis. I'm a college faculty advisor for several groups. One is TPUSA, another is the Georgian Student Organization. I'm also a fraternity faculty advisor, and I'm also someone who students come to. I know a lot of students outside of the classroom because of this. And students know that they can come to me for advice, not only on entrepreneurship or in business, but on things that are happening to them in their classes that don't quite add up, that don't seem right. And as long as I have open channels to try to create reform, try to nudge our university into the right path when it may or may not stray, then I'm satisfied with doing that and not talking about my university in this forum.
All right, let us suppose that someone who has a son or daughter about to enter college
Yep.
were to walk into your office and say, what do we have to be on the lookout for? If we want to make sure that Johnny or Susie doesn't get into any of these traps, how do we avoid them? What do we need to look out for?
Well, I list a whole host of tells. I call them tells, very much like a poker player looks for tells in your opponent. But here are tells that you can, latch onto and say, here's a threat situation that is slowly evolving, and I don't like the direction this is going to. The first thing you need to know is the person in front of you of the classroom or the seminar session, is this person an actual faculty member? Or is this person one of the bevy of clerks and enrollment managers and human lactation experts? Believe it or not, that's the case sometimes. Human lactation experts who are basically doing this as an adjunct faculty member in the co-curriculum. In other words, are you actually in a class, or are you in a situation where it's fake? This is a fake class where there are no oversight. There's no safeguards against this person utilizing the techniques that I've described here and in Brutal Minds to apply pressure and to gain access to private information that is then going to destabilize this person's belief system. Let me give you an example of what I have right here. This is a book by Sherry K. Watt called Designing Transformative Multicultural Initiatives. And in this book, this brainwasher by the name of Sherry K. Watts offers what she calls the PI, or the Privileged Identity Exploration Model, that is designed to attack and destabilize a person's sense of self and sense of identity, exhibiting, or I would say imposing or eliciting a sense of vertigo in the students. That's the brainwash right there. Now, this type of activity, when you're looking for it, is relatively easy to spot. And asking for informed consent, if you believe that this type of thing doesn't seem kosher, doesn't seem right, then start asking questions. And if you're told, well, that kind of question is not within our guidelines, well, you're in a threat situation. It's one of those things where we don't want to challenge what I'm presenting here. We want you to accept it. and to develop your critical consciousness. I would seek out sympathetic faculty members as well, people who not necessarily conservative, but liberal faculty members who have integrity and are saying, this is something that is not really what we should be doing. This should not be happening on our campus. It is the real threat to academic freedom. The enemy is already inside the wire. It's not legislators out there. It's the folks inside the wire who are doing it. And it's not, and faculty, we're the human shield for these folks without even knowing it in some cases.
All right, we have two questions, and let's address them before we wrap up our webinar. This one comes, the first one, Mao Zedong's 10+ year cultural revolution caused immense destruction to Chinese society. Can Mr. Ridgley comment on the possible long-term implications or effects on the US domestic policy and international geopolitical status of the current thought reform themes and initiative we're witnessing in academia? How much damage is this going to do?
Well, do I see relationship between what's going on in the world today with regard to China? And we're talking about geopolitics now. That's kind of like a sidelight of what I do. It's my original training. I think that there is a certain parallel between what we're seeing today and in Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. In fact, you can see the similarities in the photographs. You can see the public shaming. In fact, I would encourage everyone to go to the book, 1961 classic by Robert J. Lifton, called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. And it is a study, a very thick study. It is empirically based study of thought reform and how it was done by the communist Chinese and how it relates to academia explicitly in here. And the themes that Lifton talks about are exactly those kinds of themes that if you want to become educated on this, I think read portions of that book, minimal portions of the book, and you can begin to see the parallels that exist in the news today.
All right, here's another question. You are passionately defending open inquiry and criticizing colleagues who think there is only one way to think about things. And you talked about in your book that there are no legitimate criticisms. Do you teach your students with that kind of pedagogical sensibility?
I'll say that there are no legitimate criticisms because there's nothing false in the book. That's what's meant by no legitimate criticism. That doesn't mean that the book is theoretical in reality, and that I'm rejecting any criticisms of a theory. The book is 70% of what they themselves say about what they are doing. And so if you can come up with any legitimate criticisms of that, in fact, what I did say, that if there's anything wrong with what I said in the book, if there's anything incorrect, I will correct it. That's not consonant with saying that there are no legitimate criticisms. I think that if anything's wrong in my book, I'm happy to correct it.
We also have.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me interject. And I think that there was a kind of a jab there. Do I do that kind of pedagogical sensibility in my class? That no, there's no legitimate criticism for what I'm saying. No, of course not. In fact, we're having a class right now, an interesting discussion on technology and whether it's an unadulterated good or whether there are legitimate criticisms of the advance of technology going all the way back to the Luddites, actually before that as well, and saying, is technology a unadulterated good, which is a question that most people will say yes in my type of class, which is on technology, loaded with technology people, when actually there are criticisms against technology that in the context of the people making those criticisms may seem to be quite legitimate. And those are the kinds of discussions that we have in my class.
Someone is asking, could you post the link for your list of cargo cult journals?
Well, that would take some time, technologically savvy. I can find that link very quickly. I can tell you where let me just type that answer real quick. It's at the nas.org. There we go. And you can type in social justice, education, David Randall.
Very good. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time. Stan Ridgley, we appreciate your coming on with us and talking about your book, and we hope to see you again.
Well, I hope to be here. I enjoyed it, George. It's always good to see you.
Well, thanks so much, Stan.
reach out to me on LinkedIn if you care to.
Very good. Very good. Thank you to everyone who participated today. Thanks a lot.